few hats that will fit your noggin, and so you rotate your old dress hats down to the work hats with the sweat stains, and then you try to find a new hat. Then you yeah, then I
Yeah,
am a
you're
redneck.
right. And that's sometimes you don't even mean to. You accidentally get caught someplace where you sweat more in a hat than you intended.
There you go.
And then it gets
Just so you know,
demoted.
this is 100% live at this point. So, this is we start off with Buckethead as our first words of the broadcast for the day.
Right there, baby. That's a 7 7/8
Ladies and
hat right there.
gentlemen, these are your shepherds.
Once literally got the big head about it too.
I know. Yeah. Very, very on brand.
Oh my!
All right, so we'll gradually have folks show up. This is the beginning of our Do the Work Sans Terry today. So that means I've shifted into the color commentary spot, and we've invited in two academic scholars, UK1 and UK2, to begin participation in this discussion today. No. Hey, everybody. I know some of you probably are just kind of popping in here in just a second, but we're going to be talking today in a few minutes about a very important aspect of congregational leadership that sometimes doesn't move up into the public conversational space because for some folks it's a little uncomfortable. The idea of someone who is serving as one of the evangelists or ministers in a local church who also serves in another capacity in some congregations is challenging. They're not quite sure what to do with it. There is a little bit of anxiety about that. And I thought it felt be good, especially for preachers, which is the primary audience of our discussion, space, to think about it in advance, because we'll get more later. We'll stop for a second on the blah, blah. We're about to roll into our official time. But how are you guys doing? UK1, UK2, that's Bob and Mark. Bob, how are you doing today?
I am doing well, Philip. Good to get on here, good to talk with you guys.
We're glad that you can make it. Mark, what about you? How's the corn?
The corn is about ready to be harvested. It's sort of drying up. The beans are actually a little more dried up, but no, we're doing fine up here. A little dry, but it's good to join you today. I'm always amazed that you have me back after all of the times I've been on in the past, that you still are a glutton for punishment.
If the bar just keeps getting lower and lower, eventually everyone can get over the threshold. Hey, Ed, this is Mark Russell, Bob McPherson, and our topic today is more plainly stated: preachers serving as shepherds, elders, overseers, etc., and some of the challenges that go with that. And so we'll get there in just a second. I do have a question for each of you, because we remember these. We sometimes do these surprise questions when we start. And here's something to think about. What was one hobby, interest, love that people would be surprised that you actually like? Oh, I struck you guys with the hard one, right?
Well, I don't think it surprises anybody if they know me at all, but I like to hunt. So, but then when people see me pull up in my muddy 4-wheel drive, I don't have any surprises. I try to keep it simple.
I enjoy golfing. Now, I'm not on the level of Emerson where I play, a 72 holes every day or anything like that. But I enjoy, I find it, even though both of our boys are out of the house, I find it harder and harder to get out on the links. But that's something I do enjoy.
Yeah.
That's not, it's not surprising, but
I'm a fairly open book, but I'll say that not only do I love Broadway musicals across the board, absolutely love all of them. Been in the audience of various renditions of Les Mis, Phantom of the Opera. Recently saw a very strange production of Oklahoma last time they were in New York City. They rewrote lots of it and emphasized the laudanum scene to a new level. It really felt we were all on laudanum at that point. And so if you have never seen Oklahoma, that may be like, what's that all about? Well, now you know. You can go research that. Not only that, I was actually serving at one point earlier as a Girl Scout leader. Yes, you can do that. I was helping my daughter's Girl Scout troop learn to camp outside and outdoors for the first time. And the other leaders had never really done that before. And so I was a outside consultant, went through the whole registration process. Is this the basketball episode? Eventually. I'm sure we'll get there. Although actually all three of us only really play miniature golf.
Paul, haven't you heard? Kentucky is a football school, right, Terry?
Yeah. You could tell Paul, if it was a football episode, we wouldn't have to invite the Texas crowd. Now go ahead.
Oh, see, I don't know Paul, so I couldn't take a shot like that. So,
yeah. So, all right. So let's get into the meat of the matter. Not only is Terry not here, but he is probably going to have some interesting questions for us from the outside looking in, because our topic again is the challenge, difficulty, process, concerns of serving as an evangelist or minister with a local church, but also serving in the capacity of a shepherd or an elder. I want to start it off by asking this question. When you started to preach, go back whenever that day was, you could pick when you felt that took place. Did you ever think about holding two of those responsibilities in your hands at the same time?
Mark, you go ahead.
Well, not in a million years, because coming from Central Kentucky, it was rare for a preacher to also be a pastor. That it was rare, and in some ways it was almost frowned upon. I don't think it would have gone, Terry, in the pre-show like we talked, where somebody would actually take issue with it and be that violently opposed to it. It just wasn't done. The first time that I actually thought about serving as an elder was I was more than a decade into preaching here in Valpo. And for some reason or other, and I know my experience is different from everybody else's since I've been here for so long, but I was hoping to get some feedback, some sort of constructive criticism. And one of the elders took me aside. He says, "Well, Mark, I don't need to think about that a lot." Well, my mind starts going, "Oh dear, what have I asked for here?" And he says, "You need to stay here. You need to raise your family. You need to become an elder here one day." And I was just like, I was just wanting preaching subjects. And you put a lifetime goal out in front of me. And so it was a complete shock to me because it had never really entered my mind.
What about you, Mark? I know we talked about this last year at some point. What's your thoughts on like that origin story for me, when you thought about it?
When as a younger man, I guess I assumed it was probably an either or proposition. And my life had taken the trajectory where I hoped to someday serve as a shepherd in a local church. For those that don't know my background, out of college, I spent 20 years in the United States Navy. Then I worked in private industry for a while. So I had a lot of practical leadership experience. I made efforts through the years. We relocated a lot with the military. So I had opportunities to do a lot of teaching and things like that. So I envisioned that, what I'd like to do someday is when that phase of my life is over, settle down in one spot and then just continue doing that. And with the thought that maybe perhaps someday I could serve as a shepherd, teach Bible classes and that sort of thing in a local area. And so that was kind of the trajectory I thought my life was more headed towards. And then before that happened, got here to Bowling Green and back into this preaching thing. So mine went kind of got reversed on me in that regard.
Yeah, for me, I had this perception of that's something I'll do later. I had created a kind of a life arc where my focus will be primarily evangelistic, edification, teaching, preaching. And then as I age, and maybe that's not the best place for me, I might transition into a mentor space or help out with a local church and its leadership. But it would be on the other end of my kind of view of things. And as I think probably is the case for each of you, maybe that plan never really survived contact with reality anyway. Like it didn't really last too much. And the process of kind of coming to grips with how will I manage that shift in responsibility and roles is pretty significant. I don't know, and Mark or Bob, you guys can speak to us to different degrees. I felt a different type of responsibility immediately with every single thing that I say, both in the sermon and outside of the sermon or the Bible class. Like it just, there's a higher level of my personal expectations to be on the ball, to consider the outcome of what I say, knowing there is some legitimate new weight. Bob, have you started sleeping yet? I don't know if that's
No,
a thing for you.
no, I think you're right though. I think that causes me to pause more. Sometimes in my mind, I'm thinking, which hat am I wearing right now? And sometimes that is, I actually say that out loud, perhaps, and put a disclaimer out sometimes to do that. But I do think it's a consideration. One thing, I was purposeful about when I was serving as a deacon and an evangelist for a while before I served as elder. But so I made an effort to try to preach all the things in support of the eldership and our responsibility as sheep toward the shepherds consistently, regularly, and passionately enough that if I ever switch sides, people would say, he was saying that years ago. Does not appear self-serving, or try to make it not appear self-serving to talk about that relationship between the flock and the shepherds, because again, hopefully people, if they've known me long enough, they'll say, oh, no, he's always been willing to say that and always done that. So in one sense, I was thinking about it consciously, trying to take pressure off our shepherds. And I think that helps me now, that I can still say and do some things that what I really noticed, Philip, was if I hadn't done that, there'd be maybe a hesitancy to say some things now that probably need to be said.
I know when I first started, I was, and Terry asked the question, do you think we ought to be more careful? I thought I was careful. And then when I became a pastor, I'm just like, oh, and it surprised me, and I was disappointed in myself. And it took me, a couple of years ago, somebody asked me this same question, and I don't think it was on Do the Work, but it honestly, it took me 5-6 years until I felt like I'd kind of hit my stride. Does that make any sense? That the hardest question I had came from my wife in the process that the other elders set up here at Valpo. And she says, do you think you can do both? And I just honestly looked at her and I said, honey, I don't know. I don't know if I could do. Now there is some shepherding that goes along with being a preacher. I mean, that there's some shepherding aspect, but actually being fully responsible along that line. And then I think that changed my preaching a little bit. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I mean, I'm definitely not the same preacher I was, 20 years ago. But when I started serving about 11 years ago, it was, I actually became more intense and more definitive in the words that I was planning. And I started manuscripting. I had never been a manuscripter before. And I became even more careful moving forward like that. And looking back, I guess the word would have been disappointed that I wasn't that careful before as, a proclaimer.
Yeah, I'll say this for me. The change fit into a different area. I mean, I was already someone who was very careful with what I planned to say, like what my manuscript looked like and what my notes looked like and all that. But my methodology was to try to avoid the public role of telling people what was going on and informing the congregation, and even being publicly in this leadership niche that you're going to get up and make announcements to the congregation about upcoming events, especially when I was younger. I really just tried to I don't think that's a great fit. Like, it needs to be one of the elders. This needs to be one of the deacons. Not necessarily saying that's the best method for everyone, or even the best method for you. I just did that as a emotional way to kind of clear the space. But that doesn't work anymore. I can't function that way. And even after I was appointed as a deacon, I couldn't do that anymore. Like I had responsibilities. I had to be in this role that I would take on any other space, but not in the congregational context because I wanted others in that spot instead. But now I was one of those others. So for me, that even actually affected the way I approach those announcements. Where if I've got an announcement to make before the congregation, I might be found taking that announcement and putting it into an editor. I love to use the Hemingway app. I don't know if you guys have found it. It's a great little way to take your sentences and have them be much more direct and not full of extra words, which is like, again, a challenge for me. So I use that all the time for public announcements in particular. Because it takes a paragraph and makes it into a sentence that says the same thing. So I try to do that now, and I'll add this to it. There's an importance to think about the long perspective that's different than the evangelist's role to motivate to the today. The work of the minister, the work of the preacher, the work of the exhorter is about, in part, pushing on it to the point where people are ready to make today's decisions. Where the shepherd looks at the flock and says, yeah, today, but yes, we got to build a tower tomorrow. So how do we get from today to tomorrow? And that will, of necessity, change how you see the field. And I think there's some value to it. Terry talks about it from his perspective too. And look, there's a bit of boat rocking that shepherds and elders do too. Like, you got to get people out of their complacency, but I think you approach it in each of those roles differently than you might otherwise. Let me add this. I think also to a degree, and I think Mark, maybe you did as well, Bob, mentioned that evangelists kind of already quasi-shepherd to begin with. The difference is the size of the flock. An evangelist may mentor 1, 2, 3 people. They may shepherd their home. They may have unique relationships with younger or older Christians where in some ways they're shepherding-ish there. But now all of a sudden you're shepherding all the flock and they're all different. And it's just vastly different thing. Even if we've been part of that group for 40 years, they're different now. And there's not a real great way to explain that difference ahead of time, but you can certainly prepare for that transition in some ways. So let me add this, and I think this is something that comes up often. In the individuals that were involved in your process of appointment, and we'll talk about that probably towards the end of it as well. How did the process mature through objections? Not on your root or rote qualifications, whether or not you met the biblical standard, but how did that work out for you in the sense of dealing with some of the criticisms of, hey, I don't think a preacher should be doing this. The criticisms of, can you do it? Mark mentioned that earlier, like, can you actually do that? What was your way of approaching it, and how did you kind of pre-inform yourself? Because there's some young preacher watching this today that is saying, man, I never want to be an elder. I just want to preach, and I want to let those guys handle this. And 15 years down the road, that guy's going to be appointed as an elder somewhere. And he should be prepared today, even if he thinks he doesn't want to. And we'll talk about that at the end as well. So what about you guys? What were some of the objections?
I'll just say, because Mark may have more to say on this than I do. I didn't personally, at the time when I was going through being appointed, I didn't personally interact with anyone who had an objection to a preacher generically serving as a shepherd. We talked pre-roll that I'd been in places and times in that conversation previously at other times and places. But a lot of that, as Mark indicated a while ago, his wife asking, can you do both? And so a lot of it I was getting to that internal pros, cons, why not now, but maybe later, that kind of thing was going through. So I think maybe a younger guy listening could still think about these kind of things. My primary why not, or why I wouldn't want to yet, or why maybe later was the thing to anticipate. I thought for me was there is somewhat going to be, to some extent, different people. It'll vary, but a change in the dynamic with some people. When you show up now, you get wearing a certain hat or certain badge, right? So I thought about the good I was doing, were the conversations I was able to have as the evangelist that maybe some people would be hesitant to go to one of the shepherds with. Was it a chance for me both to learn things that cooperatively I could help the shepherds know some things, be another set of eyes and ears, not as a spy, but just as another person connected with the flock that was out among the sheep, where I was privy to things that might be cut off when I assumed that role. So that was a consideration for me. How much good am I able to do now without that? How does that complement what the flock was doing? So I think that's something to think about as years go by and as your relationship changes with the congregation. And then for me, just a little bit, not exactly what you asked, but what kind of turned, or the why to do it, were things that were very specific or practical to our situation here. The flock got to a size where the good shepherds that we had serving previously knew they needed some help, and so then it was then that sense of, well, if I can help and I'm being and that I'm willing to do that. And so those two things you kind of weighed out until you saw that you could do that. Combine that with the character of the men that were already serving to avoid some of the pitfalls that will probably be another follow-on thing we'll talk about. Pitfalls or perceived pitfalls of serving as both, or difficulties of serving as both a shepherd and an elder. So what I would say is I think it's an evolution. Mark described his, and his took the whole time he's been at Valpo until 11 years ago. That was an evolution of things changing, perspectives changing, congregational dynamics changing, maturity in your own family changing, to where what doesn't seem practical now may seem like the right choice that's most mutually beneficial for you and the flock at some point in the future. But there will be some folks who have different perspective on whether preachers should do that or not. And that's what you asked originally.
Yeah. Mark, what about you?
There has been a level of trust here in Valpo with me that goes way beyond what I deserve and what I should have been granted. And so facing objections hasn't really been a problem. But it was more the other elder and I, who were appointed at the same time. He had a conversation with me too, because he's obviously been a Christian for a long time, been around in the area, and it's a little more old school. And he asked the same question. Cindy was the first one. And John, my brother, he says, "Mark, what do you think about this?" And I said, and I told him, I says, "Honestly, John," and again, this is a very local example, I feel like I'm doing some shepherding anyway. But, like Bob mentioned, there were folks who were coming to Cindy and me with problems that should have gone to the elders. And one of the elders at the time was aging pretty rapidly. And one of the other elders was handling a lot of the burden. And I saw it weighing on him. And that actual kind of a pragmatic approach was probably what tipped me over to going ahead and saying yes, even though I wasn't 1,000% sure that I should have been. And just the aspect of that, I'm already doing the shepherding, I'm trusted by folks, because I honestly think my greatest critic in this was whether I could internally do it or not. Because at times, as a preacher, if you're worth your salt, you're gonna have doubts about yourself. You need to question yourself. It's when I have been arrogant is when I have made the biggest faux pas in my life, in the pulpit and out. And so it was. I've not been in a sort of a litigious or a critical place very often. And I could imagine how that would be very difficult at times for a preacher to serve as both a pastor and a preacher if they were in a very critical culture in a church.
I just want to add one thing. Something Mark said reminded me of something I thought about. And I think, Mark's to be commended here, because I think as a preacher, you need to be watching out for if you sense you start becoming an alternative to communicating with the elders. And then that becomes a look in the mirror, because the temptation might be to relish that. The temptation might be to say, oh, Whereas I think it takes some humility to say, I don't want to become that. And if that then becomes the impetus to say, if I'm in a position where I can become one of them, that would push me one way. So I think that because and that doesn't necessarily, sometimes I think that just happens naturally. You communicate with a lot of people. They're comfortable talking with you. They're used to seeing you talking. You guys know just demographically, you can have some people you're closer to or whatever. But I go back to that young preacher you mentioned, Philip, that might be watching and thinking about, if you get to that place where you're preaching and you start to feel like, uh-oh, or you feel like, hey, I'm becoming an alternative to the elders, people are coming to me instead of being happy about that, take a mature perspective on that and make sure that you're part of that long-term growth and mutual strength and building up of the congregation as opposed to becoming a possible alternative, if that makes sense.
There is a temptation in wanting to become a pastor, wanting to become a bishop so that you have more say. And that's the idea of wanting the job too much. Be careful what you ask for. And there's this balance that every one of us has to find in our particular localities. But I didn't want it that bad, but I thought I needed to serve. And I had folks that actually came to me. I didn't advertise for it, I guess, maybe,
Yeah. Well, let's just put it this way. If you have to run for the office, you're not qualified for the office. So let me think about it this way, or suggest this concept to you. Marty Broadwell made a comment recently about the way in which the elders' family, the pastor's family, to integrate into the value to the local work. This is giving them insight to the edges and dynamics of a local church. They're going to be outside his personal reach. So for Marty, you think about kids and grandkids and the way in which those kids and grandkids report the health of a local church to him. Like, hey, we saw this, you weren't there, but this is how we understood and interpreted it. This is how we read the announcement. Like, the elders said this, but it felt like that to me. It didn't feel like what they were saying actually resonated with the need that I personally share. And so a family connected to a local church already creates this feedback opportunity for an elder. And then a multiplicity of elders then expands the reach into the local flock, because they will all have different levels of interaction with that local community of Christians. And now you add in another one who had a different reach before, because it's very normal for each of these men serving these capacities to bring to the table a different reach, deeper, shorter, wider, whatever. And so congregations should recognize, and this is the teaching standpoint, that having a variety of elders, different ages, different experiences, all qualified, is actually a boon to the local church. And should that be one of the evangelists, guess what skills he brings to the table? He understands personal work. He understands evangelism. He understands the challenges of a job that may have had him moving 5 or 6 times, like a guy in the military might bring that experience to the table. And so there are advantages to the unique knowledge that somebody has, so they can flow in this loop of opportunity where it flows from the flock to the shepherding team, and then out of the shepherding team back to the flock that doesn't exist. And I think that's an important thing. I really think that that's something that we all struggle with. I don't want to add this. I saw Milbert's, comments. I don't personally know the full context of his comment, but I want to include a little note about it here. The process of shepherd, pastor, elder agreement is consensus and then public sameness. The very worst thing an elder can do is to publicly disagree with his fellow elders about the local work. Like that's because the reality is they do disagree. The reality is often as elders, I'll say this for me, as elders, we make decisions that are good for the flock that may not be what I want personally. And that's nothing new to anyone who's been a parent, anyone who's led anything. Like, you make decisions that are good for the family at your own sacrifice. Like, it's just the same thing. So I hope that kind of begins to address some of Milbert's comments. I'm not sure I caught the full question in there, but we'll try, and you can ask another question and get clarification too.
One question, can I raise a question for you two? One of the things that I have, and maybe it's because of the 11 years, I don't find myself wearing preacher hat, shepherd hat. I have become it's just me. And when you talk to me, I'm just Mark, but and so I'm wondering how you guys, if you're far enough in it, or if you see it completely differently, how are you guys handling the two? I mean, I recognize it's two different. Ultimately, it's two different things, where you feed the flock or you do the work, as it were. And so, how are you guys handling that?
Bob, do you want to go first, or I can go first?
Well, clearly, I'm on the steep part of the learning curve here. I'm still trying to figure that out, Mark, and I think I mentioned that even earlier. I'm more thoughtful about that, and it mostly, I think, it manifests itself not in that I'm having to make public pronouncements that it's one or the other, but it dovetails into something we talked earlier about maybe careful in exactly how I'll say things in a sermon. But I think maybe in more years it'll be more seamless. It'll be just a natural evolution. But I think I would think about trying to be sure if what I'm about to say is it something we have consensus, and as the shepherds we're wanting to present, or is it Bob making a point in an illustration? And so I'm really still trying to figure that out. I would like to think that in time it would be more of the seamless nature that you described there.
Well, I don't know if it's seamless or not. I mean, we are talking about me here, but
right. So I'll say for me, I am less likely than I once was to make that same visual reference of taking off the preacher hat, putting on the elder hat kind of illustration. But I do catch myself at times, and sometimes I even include it in my manuscript notes. There are points where I am advocating broadly as an evangelist for things that people should consider doing. And there are times for the local church here where I'm advocating that Eastside must do this, because I think there's a significant difference in those two things. Mm-hmm. And when you are not one of the shepherds, almost everything fits into the first category, more so than the second one. I know that there are many who would be of the opinion that, well, elders don't have any true authority to mandate things. I disagree. I think the elders' authority is only effective on the basis of their example. That's true. But that authority gets used with that credit you built up by your example when you ask or tell someone what to do. And we all do those things. And there's a shift between asking and telling and lording. And we don't lord it over people, but we do tell people, hey, I need you to do this. It has the hint of a request, but the expectation of the request will be given the answer of, yes, I will do that and make sure it happens. And so I am far more mindful of that bridge between request and telling, and fearful of the last bridge that I don't want to even be on. And so that does modulate things. But like Mark, in the end, you're going to get me. Like, they asked me to serve as an elder. That means you get whatever it means for my wonderful wife. You get whatever it means for my family. And that means you're going to get some taco references. That means you're going to get pop culture references, etc. Like, you're going to get that, and so you asked for it. So here it is. Here's the buffet. Doesn't mean I do it well. It just means that that's kind of how that process is playing out. Here's the thing that I think is important, especially for younger shepherds to understand, is that yes, there is a significant time commitment. There's no question about that. And there's no way that you can set a budget for it on a weekly basis, because some weeks it may take quite a bit of your extra time, and some weeks it will take less of your extra time. And I don't think there's been a week where it took no time at all. That will affect your home and your family life. So you need to become, this is like preparing the elder in advance. You need to become an efficient, hardworking preacher to prepare for your future. I wonder if I were to ask the question of preachers who serve as elders and preachers who don't serve as elders, percentage-wise, which group has a larger percentage of people who plan their sermons way out in advance, and which group has a percentage that don't? I think I already know the answer, but I can't fathom some of the weeks I've had without having some prep. What about you guys in that same area? What early advice would you give to preachers today who at some point in the future might serve tomorrow?
I just want to, it resonated with me. I'll just give an illustration. This, everyone's going to have thought about this. Isn't that hard for someone to imagine? But as you were talking about that, I realized this past Sunday. So it began with a visiting preacher who we're considering supporting elsewhere. So morning services, 1 o'clock meeting with him, 30 minutes between meeting with him for the elders to talk before a men's training class started at 3:30, which we did up until the point the evening worship service started at 5, which we had a meeting set up with someone after that, which we ended up ultimately baptizing someone. So my lovely wife is at home with dinner guests, and I get home at 9:40 Sunday night by the time all that got finished. So that's just a anecdotal of what you were talking about.
Seems normal.
And when I was filling out my calendar last Monday, I didn't have it that full, but you sometimes those things happen like that. But so yes, that's true. And that's not a complaint or anything like that. It's just reality. And I think you're right. I think it makes me more purposeful about having ideas of what I want to talk about. The combination of something that was mentioned earlier too is as I get better at thinking with a little longer range, as I get better about thinking about where does this group need to be in 2 years, in 5 years, Lord willing, I think that helps focus my preaching to some extent about playing the long game. And there are some things that I don't have to make all those points this week, Lord willing. I'll come back around and add some things to that. So I do think it affects the approach and the preparation, maybe even some of the subject matter that's all of a sudden becomes more important. I'll put this out as a caveat for me that I'm learning and be interested in you two guys listen to, is I'm having to be very thoughtful about remembering to feed the whole flock. And not just preach lessons as pertain to the 20% of people maybe meeting with or meeting about at a given time, not get pulled into that vortex, but just so I having to think about that somewhat intentionally, as the kids say. But I think you're right. We can't help but one affect the other.
That's right, Bob. You're slaying it. That's what the kids would actually say. You're slaying it. Keep slaying, King. What about you, Mark? You got any advice for those young fellas?
This may seem, well, I'm just going to say it. One of the strongest things that I think I have going for me is a very strong, transparent wife with me, and encouraging, as a young preacher, encouraging your bride in strength and having a transparent relationship where she can look at you and go, "What did you say today?" That sermon, because you're going to get the, good job, Brother McPherson, boy, Terry slayed it today, or well, maybe not Terry. Phil, you did such a great job today, and actually having a wife who will look at you and go, "You said almost nothing today," and having the confidence to actually say that instead of, being the classic kind of a milk toasty kind of a wife. And I don't know, Marlene, I don't know, but having her as such a strength has been an amazing. There is a confidence that you have somebody who will look at you in your face and say, "Don't read your press clipping, Slick."
Yeah.
Well,
so I will make this public knowledge. Jill has, and the other kids, the kids have too, has a notepad, like a little note on her note-keeping app, as a list of all of two things. One, words that I've said that she's quite certain nobody else knows. I've gotten off on a tangent. And two, statements that I put words together with that I intended to be very informative, but end up being nonsense in the application space. I want to encourage young evangelists to embrace such a list and learn to be better from it. That these kind of feedback opportunities are rare. And Colton, yes, I understand that that's a toddler experience. Realize this: your goal isn't actually to put your kids to sleep with the sermon, but a good sermon might do that. So you got to figure out where it is in the middle of those two things. It'll be okay.
Oh my, that's funny.
Those are factual realities of the preacher's wife that all wives probably share to differing degrees, but the preacher's wife most often doesn't have the ability to tag in someone to jump off the top ropes and take a kid off their hands as quickly as some other situations might be. But there are others who are in far worse circumstances too. We're kind of getting past our 35 minute window here. We've got about 35 minutes of actual content. But we haven't certainly touched the hem of the garment. There's a couple other things I just want to encourage congregations to understand. Arbitrarily limiting or expanding who can serve as shepherds is detrimental to the health of a local church. So if you say someone who works in this field could never be a shepherd, or you say, well, we need to have shepherds, so our criteria are going to just keep getting looser and looser and less, in both of those cases, you're going to have created long-term harm to the flock. So preachers, prepare yourself to serve just like anybody else would. Yes, your role is busy, but so is the guy who is running a business and is a coach for his kid's soccer team and has a sick parent and is trying to finish their licensing process for work. They're doing all those same things. Do not think that they don't work as hard as you work in your field. It's shared labor together. So I just want to straight up advocate for the inclusion of all faithful believers in the growth process of becoming elders one day. And they may not be ready today. They may grow into some areas they haven't grown into. And I think that's something that needs to happen. It's an advocacy spot. And as my general answer to this point, at this point, when folks who kind of buck back at the idea of the preacher being an elder, I point out now that in the biblical text, their position doesn't match the reality that God inspired in a text that explains that those who are serving as elders, who also labor in preaching and teaching, are worthy of double honor. And right afterwards is the key passage that goes into paying them. That's verse 18. So my advocacy is, hey, look, get there and learn to do the work, because that's part of the work for the need. And Terry's right to point the counterpoint out there. It may be best for an evangelist not to serve. I, generally speaking, though, have a conviction that the local church needs every person who is qualified and is desiring to see the church grow serving in those roles. And arbitrarily limiting it is risky, if not unhealthy. You guys get the last shout outs, and we're going to go UK1. You get to say whatever you want to say. And if you got something you want to encourage folks to think about, here's your chance. And then UK, thing one, thing two, you guys can go back to back here.
No, I don't have anything in particular. I appreciate the opportunity to get on and think about this, talk about this. And like I said, I'm a student of the game, so I appreciate listening to your thoughts and Mark's thoughts as well.
Well, as always, I appreciate you having me on and setting the bar lower so that you can have me on in full
It's
confidence.
low for me.
And so, but I would just hope that in the focusing on the equipping that we're doing and in the focusing on the shepherding, that it doesn't become so much of a political thing, like it is in some places, that it becomes sort of and I realize this is sort of nonsensical, sort of an organic spiritual experience where men grow into the idea of being equippers and shepherds and pastors, and they become the servants that God has blessed them to be in their situation, and not run from it. And I hope there comes a time in the culture of local churches, especially here in America, where we don't have to worry about the cantankerous old man who doesn't think, well, we never had preachers and elders they were the same time. And I hope as a church we grow past that in the kingdom.
Well, and I'll add this as a last little caveat. There needs to be balance in all of these things, but realize this: there will come a time when churches will fail for leadership. And if folks don't step up, those churches will just fail sooner than later. If you believe in the value of the local church, if you believe in the value of the kingdom, learn to lead, and learn today, not tomorrow. So if you're 20, start tagging along with stuff. Start asking. And if you're 50 or 70, look to those 20-year-olds and say, come with me.
Mm-hmm.
We need to go and do a few things. And it's going to be uncomfortable, but it'll be better because the two of us do it together. And
Amen.
we'll be better because of it. All right, everybody, have a great day. Thanks for your participation here. And any complaints can be directed to Terry Francis. I'm sure he will respond to them with his kindest